How to Make Our Mental Pictures Come True. A series of easy lessons in the art of visualizing by George Schuebel. Part 2. Chemistry of Visualizing. Chapter 5. Mental Chemical Process Explained. We now have reviewed the chemical principles involved in visualizing, and now in a general way we observe how these principles work out in connection with our visualizing studies. Previously, we have spoken of the light image in the dark chamber of the camera and of the thought image in the illuminating chamber of our consciousness. The manner in which both of these images are established is pertinent here. When the photographer levels his camera in the direction of any outward object, the light rays of the sun in falling back from the object are caught and focused by the photographic camera eye, then transmitted to the illuminating chamber, and there assembled, as we have observed, forming an image of light or projected object exactly like the object toward which the camera is directed. This is precisely what takes place in connection with the illumined mental object in the mind when our faculties become directed toward it. If it has proved a pleasing or strong mental excitant, if one can sense it strongly enough, so to speak, it becomes held and established in consciousness, and we say that we are thinking about it. The truth of the matter is that we are not only thinking about it, but upon it. It means that we are directing against our thought the vibrations or pulsations of a mind light much finer than our thought object has become. Just as the unformed light of the sun is a much finer light than the formed material objects which were once a part of the sunlight. The mental light pours itself upon and about our thought and bathes it just as the cruder light of the sun continually pours itself against all outward objects, and in the same manner in which the light rays of the sun are deflected from an object and thrown back into space. So our objective thinking, in pouring itself against the formulated mental object in the mind, is deflected and thrown back again in consciousness. However, here is where the wonder of the mental photographic process appears in striking contrast to the present photographic process employed by the photographer. If our object of thought is a strong enough excitant within us, a mind heat is generated, the process of which we will explain later. The mind heat gently and imperceptibly sets the movement of the finely arranged and adjusted group of mechanical faculties which belong to what we call the intellect, and which we have described as constituting the various parts of the camera of the mind. They become automatically and gently leveled in the direction toward which our attention has been excited, so that we are now focusing our mental camera, so to say, in the direction of the mental object established in our sense consciousness. At the same time, in the manner in which the light rays of the sun pour themselves upon the object and fall back, so our thinking upon and about our mental object is nothing different than the light rays of our thinking which pour themselves upon our mental object in the form of a continuous spray of mental light, undifferentiated, unspecialized, as yet in the sense of form. But when our mental photographic eye becomes leveled against our object, when it catches and focuses this flood of deflected mental light and transmits it into the illuminating chamber of our consciousness, it becomes an image of mental light, exactly like the mental object toward which our illumined thinking has been directed. The light of our thinking takes shape. It becomes a differentiated and specialized form of mental light, and by projection it becomes in itself the mental object, so that thereafter we no more deal with the object existing in our outer or sense consciousness, but with the light which has formed itself as an image of the object, and which has established itself in the illumining chamber of our inner consciousness. End of Chapter 5. Chapter 6. How an imaged thought is impressed. Having established his light image in the illuming or dark chamber of his camera, the photographer presses the bulb, the cambric slide or shutter opens and closes according to the time of exposure required, and the wonder of the photographic impression is wrought. The imaged light has streamed forward, and its actinic or chemical rays have penetrated and embedded themselves upon the highly sensitized and permeable substance of the film, and thus have become impressed in the exact form of the object which they imaged. In a sense, it may be said that a form of sunlight is captured by the photographer and is impressed into service for his particular purpose of outward reproduction. It becomes temporarily an imprisoned light absorbed into the sensitive gelatin substance of the film. In fact, the particularly concentrated chemical quality of sunlight, out of which the light image forms itself, becomes by absorption and penetration a part of the compounded substance itself, taking on its plastic body, and by chemical affinity affecting the marriage or union which results in the quickening of the light image. Simultaneously, a transformation of the sensitive film substance itself has taken place within the area in which the light image has struck it. Its composition has become changed. The student will recall that previously it was an entirely passive substance, and that while the silver electrons distributed and suspended in it possessed potentially all the evidence of life, yet this life was in a quiescent state. However, now by the vibrating energy of the light, which passes into the substance with the entrance of the light image, this substance has become converted from a passive to a magnetically active light substance. Also, we recall that the film substance heretofore was an unformulated substance, but now the light image has brought with it its own peculiar formulating and specializing characteristics, so that at the moment of union, the plastic light substance develops a formulating and specializing power by means of which the first stages in the development of the light image occurs within itself. If this impressive moment could be observed microscopically, we would find the electrons in the streaming rays of light embracing the trillions of silver electrons suspended in the film substance, and in this union affecting the mysterious and subtle transfiguration which chemists are unable as yet to fully explain. All that they know is that the positive chemical rays of the outer light have entered into and impregnated the static electrons of silver, merging with them by a process of smelting, changing them into a more metallic quality, and charging them with their own energy and powers, so that these electrons develop a high degree of whirling activity or aliveness. Heretofore passive, then they have become literally enlightened or lightened up by contact with the imaged light, so that in union with it, these tiny electrons of silver as a whole become basically the magnetic and metallic matter which forms the light image in the substance of the film, and which also later will form the body of the developed film. Speaking of the light image, we can say that what has transpired at this moment of photographic impression is that a certain specialized form of outer objective light has passed into and become identified with a passive and highly impressionable film substance for the purpose of becoming a more substantially specialized form of light, and for the time being, it has become so in an inner objective sense. We can say also that it is a differentiated form of light which has gone into and become identified with the inner undifferentiated substance on the film, becoming subjectively conditioned for the moment in order to reassert itself in a further and more substantial differentiation of light later on. It is, we may say, a going inwardly of this formulated, specialized and differentiated light into the film and becoming the active and magnetic element of its compounded metallic substance, so that it may again appear as light later on, but in the denser and more permanent form of the finished photograph. We dwell upon this transition here because throughout the entire visualizing process, as throughout the process of photography, we observe this phenomenon of specialization, differentiation, and particularization in order to produce an ultimate result. By this entrance into the film substance, the light image is, we may say, on its way toward the first stage of its outward tangible materialization or reproduction as a photograph. It becomes a more tangible and substantial imaged object than when it was merely an image of pure light, because it has clothed itself now in a metallic body formed out of the enfilming and plastic film substance in which it embedded itself. It becomes now not only a further specialized and differentiated form of the sunlight, as the photographer saw it in the illuminating chamber of his camera a moment before, but it also becomes a protected form of light, pulsating at a different degree of vibration and energy now from that of the sunlight of which it was at one time a part. And for this reason, the photographer carefully protects and seals the light image on the film from contact with the external light vibrations of the outer light until the darkened developing room is reached. So, with the illumined thought image, which is held in the dark chamber of the consciousness until released by the will or camera shutter of the mind, it pours its formulated light self upon the highly impressionable and conditioned substance of subjective thinking. In this permeable thinking substance, it becomes embedded and impressed, and a greater wonder than that of the photographic impression has been wrought. In a mentally scientific way, we may say with perfect correctness that the imaged thought is a form of chemical mental light which has been captured by the mental camera eye and impressed into service out of the mind, whether our own or that of another, for the particular purpose of outward reproduction as a thing in our lives. The imaged thought for the moment becomes an imprisoned thought. In fact, by penetration, absorption, and embedment in the very substance of subjective thinking, the thought becomes a part of the compounded mind substance itself, taking on its plastic passive qualities, and by mental-chemical affinity, causing a marriage or union of two phases of thinking, which results in a quickening of the light image in the mind. At the same moment, an alteration of the subjective mind substance itself takes place. Within the area of mind affected by the enclasped thought image, the thinking becomes changed from a purely passive to a magnetically active mode. The mental chemical elements suspended in this state of thinking, we can say, have become magnetized. If we were able to observe these mental chemical elements at the moment of impression, we would see the trillions of tiny mentoids in an inconceivable whirl or state of activity. Heretofore passive, these hardly imaginable units of subjective phase of mind have become electrified and enlightened by contact with and absorption of the imaged mental light, so that now in affinity with this light of the mind, they become the quickened and basically active magnetic substance of our imaged thought. The thought image takes on a state of extreme aliveness. We can say that what has occurred at this moment of thought impression is this: a certain specialized form of mental light, which we call an imaged thought reflecting our outer or objective mode of thinking, has passed into and become a part of the inner highly impressionable mode of thinking substance, which we term the subjective mode of mind. In order to become a more substantially specialized form of thought, and for the time being, it has become so in an inner subjective manner. We can say that a differentiated form of thought has gone into and become a part of the inner undifferentiated phase of our thinking substance in order to come forth again in a further, ever different outward and more substantial form of the thought or thing, a going inward into mind substance in order to reappear in the outward as subjective mind substance itself, but in the denser, compounded form of matter which subjective mind substance is caused to become in its outward formulation and expansion when acted upon by the objectively imaged thought. Also, we could say that by this mental process of impression, our imaged thought is on its way toward the first stage of its outward tangible materialization or reproduction as a thing, a circumstance, or a condition of outward life. It becomes a more tangible, palpitating, vitalized, and magnetic object in the consciousness than when it was simply a reflected object of mental light, because the thought has now taken for its living body the infilming and plastic substance of the subjective state of thinking in which it has embedded itself. It becomes now not only a specialized and differentiated form of mind light, but it also becomes a protected form of mental light, highly sensitive, highly susceptible, highly magnetized, and we may say further differentiated from the objective mind light which was seen in the illumining chamber of the mind, pulsating at a different degree of mental vibration from that of the general outward mode of objective thinking. It must be kept from contact with or exposure to the kind of mental light which is represented in the external vibrations of the outward method of thinking, whether emanating from our own or other minds. The imaged thought, which was at one time a part of the objective thinking, now becomes a part of what we know as subjective thinking, and so must not come in contact with the former at this stage of the visualizing process. For this reason, the impressed thought image is carefully protected and sealed with the will, as we shall subsequently see. It is now a mentally photographed thought, a living object of the mind, forming itself out of the filmy and plastic texture of the subjective mind substance. Hereafter it will take tangible shape in the subsense consciousness, awaiting only time and the proper mental conditions for its fixation, hardening, transference, and outward development into the visible sense world where we can feel and see and otherwise become cognizant of it. We can say of the thought image what the photographer is able to say of his light image, that it is on its way toward the first stage of its outward tangible materialization or reproduction as a mental photograph, and when we understand this consciously and fully, then all doubt about the reality of the mental photographic process will cease. We have only to consider the fact that the photographer's film has impressed upon it nothing more than a collection of light rays, nothing more than a light image offset by a shadow, and which is altogether invisible to the sense sight. Yet, when he subsequently applies the appropriate developing process to it, he finds that which for the moment is invisible on the sensitive surface of the photographic film gradually formulates itself into that which is visible to the eye. It is a marvelous fact, yet perfectly natural in both instances, and that which is true of the photographic film is just as true of the subjective, impressionable element of the mind of which the film is the outward chemicalized correspondent. Our heart's desire forms itself into that which is but a thought at first. The thought becomes projected and impressed upon our subjective thinking, and by the process of development next to be explained, becomes the thing which is visible to our eyes. End of chapter 6 of How to Make Our Mental Images Come True by George Schuebel. Narrated by Rex King.